All right, today we are diving into a conflict that absolutely shattered empires and totally redrew the map of the world as we know it. World War I. They called it the Great War, and honestly, for good reason. Its legacy? Well, it's still shaping our lives today.
You know, it all kicked off with just one single fateful moment. One moment that would ignite a global catastrophe. But it makes you wonder, right? How could one act of violence
Actually plunge the entire world into a war that would end up costing millions upon millions of lives and totally redefine the 20th century? Well, let's get into it. So, our story starts with that one little spark that lit the fuse. We're talking about a single shot fired in the city of Sarajevo. Okay, so picture this. June 28th, 1914. The heir to the entire Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, is assassinated. And the person who did it? A Serbian nationalist. Now, this wasn't just any murder. No, this was a direct attack on an empire, and it was the one act that would set off an absolute diplomatic firestorm all across Europe. And the collapse that followed? It was shockingly fast. I mean, in just 5 weeks, a small regional crisis just exploded into a world war. It was like a set of dominoes. First, boom, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. Then Russia, which was Serbia's big ally, starts mobilizing its army. Germany sees this and sees it as a direct threat. So what do? They declare war on both Russia and its ally France. And then, when Germany invades neutral Belgium to get to France, well, that's what pulls Great Britain into the fight. Just a perfect, tragic chain reaction. But here's the thing. That gunshot, it was only the spark. The truth is, Europe was basically a powder keg just waiting for a match. It had been primed for an explosion for years. So to really get this war, we have to look at why the entire continent was so ready to blow. You know, historians often point to this perfect storm of 4 big issues. First, you've got militarism. There was this huge arms race happening across Europe. Then alliances, a super tangled web of treaties that basically said an attack on one is an attack on all. Then imperialism. All the big European powers were fiercely competing for colonies all over the globe. And finally, nationalism, this really intense pride that fueled rivalries and made groups want their own independence. Let's zoom in on that alliance system for a second, because it's key. It was actually designed to keep the peace through this idea of mutual defense, but it did the exact opposite. By locking all these countries into these pacts, it pretty much guaranteed that any tiny local conflict would automatically blow up into a massive continent-wide war. It was basically a tripwire system for total catastrophe. So what you had was Europe effectively split into 2 huge armed camps. On one side, you had the Triple Entente, that's France, Russia, and Great Britain. And on the other side, the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. The continent was so starkly divided, there was just no middle ground left. There was zero room for error. Okay, so now let's shift gears and head to the battlefield to see how this whole thing was actually fought. Because let me tell you, this was not like any war that had ever come before it. It was a new, absolutely brutal kind of warfare, one defined by stalemate and just unimaginable slaughter. You know, almost everyone thought this war would be over by Christmas. Germany had this grand strategy, the Schlieffen Plan, which was all about a lightning-fast victory. But it failed. The German advance just stalled right outside of Paris, and then both sides did the only thing they could. They dug in. They created this vast network of trenches that would soon stretch all the way from the Swiss border to the North Sea. And that locked the Western Front in this horrific stalemate that would last for years. And life in those trenches, I mean, it was a living nightmare. Soldiers lived in mud, surrounded by rats, disease, and the constant terrifying threat of artillery shells. And the idea of going over the top? That meant charging straight into a hail of machine gun fire, often just for a few yards of land. It was this static, gruesome kind of combat that really became the symbol of the whole war. And that stalemate, it was a direct result of all this new, terrifyingly efficient technology. You had rapid-fire machine guns that could just mow down entire battalions of men, making defense almost impossible to break through. You had poison gas, early tanks, warplanes, and submarines all making their grim debut. All this stuff transformed the battlefield and pretty much ensured that any attack would come at an astronomical cost in human lives. And the human cost of this new industrial warfare, it's just staggering. Over 16 million people, soldiers and civilians, lost their lives. That number is so huge, it's almost impossible to really wrap your head around. We're talking about an entire lost generation. For years, it really seemed like that stalemate would never break. Both sides were just completely exhausted. But then a major turning point came in 1917. The United States, which had been neutral up to that point, entered the war. And this massive influx of fresh American troops and all their industrial resources, it was exactly what the Allies needed to finally tip the balance of power.
So the war did eventually end, but its consequences, man, they would shape the entire next century. In this final part, we're going to explore the bitter peace that followed and the whole new set of problems it created.
On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, in 1918, the fighting finally stopped. The Central Powers, led by Germany, were defeated, and the world celebrated. People were hoping that this really, truly was the war to end all wars. But the political map of Europe was just left in ruins. 4 massive, centuries-old empires were completely wiped off the map: the Russian, the German, the Austro-Hungarian, and the Ottoman Empire. Gone. In their place, new countries were born, and the old world order was gone forever. But the peace that followed was so flawed. The 1919 Treaty of Versailles officially ended the war, but it had this devastating little thing inside it called the War Guilt Clause, and it literally forced Germany to accept full responsibility for causing all the loss and damage. It was a national humiliation that would have some really dire consequences. And this, right here, is maybe the war's most devastating legacy. The really harsh terms forced on Germany created deep economic hardship and just this festering national humiliation. And all that widespread resentment, it became the perfect fertile ground for the rise of extremist ideologies. It directly, and I mean directly, set the stage for another, even deadlier world war just 20 years later. So that leaves us with this final, haunting question. Did the Great War, the one that was supposed to be the war to end all wars, actually just set the stage for the next one? It's a really powerful reminder that how a war ends can be every bit as important as how it begins.